My neighbor's party ruined my garden, so I got even. I never thought a margarita could destroy my life, but apparently it could. That's how I knew my week was about to spiral into the kind of disaster that would make me question all my life choices. You see, I take my garden very seriously. I'm not talking about tossing a few flowers in a planter and calling it a day. No, my garden is my sanctuary, my pride and joy, and if you really want to get dramatic about it, it's basically the only thing in my life that I feel I have absolute control over. Everything from the soil pH to the exact placement of a tulip is meticulously planned. I spend hours on weekends weeding, pruning, and whispering encouragement to my plants like a slightly unhinged horticultural therapist. And my neighbor, oh him, if gardens are sacred, he is the chaos god of suburbia. His name is Brad, though honestly I'd call him disaster with a capital D if it weren't so neighborly polite to keep it at Brad. Picture this: flashy cars, blaring music, an uncanny ability to throw parties that attract every random person within a 3-mile radius, and zero regard for anything that isn't immediately convenient or fun for him. He's loud, inconsiderate, and somehow manages to act like every house on the block is just part of his personal amusement park. Normally, I tolerate him, smile politely over the fence, wave when he's in a good mood, nod through the explosion of bass from his backyard DJ sessions, but there's a simmering streak of petty rage inside me whenever his latest shenanigans brush against the edges of my carefully curated life. I like to think of it as self-control in its purest form. Until last Friday. Friday was supposed to be a normal day. I had a small trip planned to visit my aunt who lives a few towns over. A few days away from my garden I thought would be fine. I'd watered everything thoroughly, mulched the beds, arranged the new petunias in perfect gradient order, and even left a small stack of sprinklers ready to handle any surprise heat wave. I left with a quiet confidence, humming to myself about how beautifully my roses would be waiting for me upon my return. I should have known. The universe has a dark sense of humor, and Brad is the universe's little mischief agent. I got home around 6 p.m., tired but content, expecting the soothing sight of my little paradise. Instead, I was greeted by a scene that could only be described as a botanical apocalypse. My driveway was covered in cigarette butts, beer cans, and yes, someone had flung a margarita glass somewhere. Probably two. The lawn looked like a festival had taken place, only it hadn't been music and fun. It had been chaos and negligence. I froze. My eyes darted to the garden. The flower beds, my tulips, my marigolds, my carefully planted roses, all trampled, soil overturned, roots exposed. Some poor daffodils were flattened in a way that looked, well, I won't get into the gory details, but it was catastrophic. Expensive plants that had taken months to cultivate were smashed or uprooted, and the mulch I had laid out like a neat little quilt had been ripped apart like some kind of sadistic toddler's craft project. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to march straight over to Brad's house and deliver a monologue about horticultural justice that would rival any Shakespearean tragedy. Instead, I did what any rational adult would do. I walked around the perimeter of my garden, breathing heavily, trying not to combust into a cloud of pure rage. Everywhere I looked, there were signs of Brad's party. Crushed plastic cups, sticky soda stains on the grass, random party decorations impaled in my flower beds. I even found a glittery masquerade mask near my begonias. Who brings glitter to a party and then leaves it in a garden? Apparently, Brad does. I sank to my knees beside my shattered petunias and tried to focus. Deep breaths. Calm down. Rational thought. Except rational thought was fleeing in terror from the full-blown apocalypse of soil and petals before me. The sound of laughter and distant music from somewhere behind the fence, probably remnants of Brad's after-party crew, was like nails on a chalkboard to my fragile state of mind. Then came the horror of the worst realization. The koi pond. That perfect little pond I had painstakingly built, stocked with 2 tiny but majestic koi named Napoleon and Josephine, and decorated with smooth rift zones I'd spent hours placing just right. It had been trampled. There was mud in the water, leaves floating, and one of the koi looked at me with the kind of judgmental stare that only pets can manage. I swear Josephine glared as if to say, "This is your fault, human." I sat there for a solid 10 minutes, rocking slightly back and forth, muttering every curse I had ever learned, plus a few I made up on the spot. I can't, how, why, margarita. Destroy, life. It was a jumble of incoherent rage. I considered calling the police, not because this was technically a crime, but maybe they could just enforce horticultural laws. Surely there must be a statute somewhere about deliberate destruction of marigolds. No, I couldn't. That wouldn't solve it. And frankly, I didn't want to give Brad the satisfaction of seeing me unravel immediately. No, this required careful planning, observing, precision, patience. As I walked around the garden, assessing the damage, a spark of something warm and deliciously satisfying ignited in me. Revenge. Not violence, obviously. That's not my style. But clever, meticulous, slow-burning revenge. The kind that makes Brad question every life choice he's ever made without ever suspecting who's behind it. I started taking mental notes, pacing like a caged tiger. Where had people trampled the most? How many margarita stains were there? Could I use these observations to my advantage? Could subtle intimidation or sabotage send a message without ever directly confronting him? The idea itself felt thrilling. My fingers itched. My mind raced. Every potted plant became a battleground for strategy. The crushed tulips whispered possibilities. The uneven soil was a canvas. My garden, destroyed as it was now a tool in my petty arsenal. I even smiled a little when I pictured Brad walking out to his next party, clueless, while subtle chaos, meticulously orchestrated, erupted around him. I could imagine him slipping on his own poorly watered lawn, spilling drinks, watching his precious confetti sink into mud like some cosmic justice. And that's when I knew, oh yes, revenge was going to be mine. Slowly, elegantly, and in a way that would sting but never leave him suspicious. He wouldn't even see it coming. For now, I did what I had to do. I silently swore revenge. I walked the perimeter of my garden one last time, kneeling to inspect a broken stem, running my fingers through displaced mulch and whispering the tiniest, most polite of threats to the cosmos. This isn't over. I went inside, cleaned myself up, and looked out the window at the mess. My heart pounded with a mix of lingering rage and excitement. This was no longer about flowers. It was about principle, about justice, about reminding the universe that petty chaos will be met with equally petty brilliance. And so, my friends, the seeds of a grand plan were planted right there amid the mud, the trampled roses and the sticky remains of someone else's margarita-fueled oblivion. Brad had unleashed chaos on my garden. I would unleash something far more satisfying on him. The war was silent, personal, and incredibly petty, but it had begun. If they thought they could destroy my roses and get away with it, they were dead wrong. That sentence lived in my head like a little mantra for the next 48 hours. You know how sometimes when something small but meaningful is taken from you, it flips a switch? That was me. It wasn't just about the petals and the koi and the mulch. It was about the principle of having something beautiful and seeing someone stomp it into a smear of negligence. It was about respect, something Brad apparently thought came with an optional subscription. But here's the thing, I'm not an angry person by default. I'm the kind of person who reads gardening blogs at night and labels my seed packets. I don't smash things. I do not punch doors. My revenge couldn't be primal. It had to be meticulous. The kind of petty artistry that would make my grandmother nod in approval and my plants perk up like, yes, finally. So I did what any decent, slightly unhinged gardener would do. I planned. Planning is practically a hobby of mine. I love lists. Sticky notes are my friends. I started with a notebook, an actual paper notebook, because digital notes feel too ephemeral for plotting. And I made a column titled, Brad, Weaknesses, Habits. Underneath, I wrote everything I already knew and everything I assumed. It looked a little like the opening credits of a true crime show, except instead of actors' photos, there were doodles of margarita glasses and overturned lawn chairs. Observation was step one. If this were a movie, I'd cut to a montage, me peeking over bushes, squinting through windows, scribbling in the notebook. In real life, it was almost exactly that, but with less cinematic lighting and more awkward small talk with Mrs. Patel across the street. I started doing recon missions that would have made a private investigator giggle. Nothing illegal, mind you. This is petty revenge, not a Netflix drama. I set up a schedule for myself. Morning, check the perimeter for new damage or party debris. Afternoon, casually water the surviving plants while monitoring Brad's routine. Evening, check for lights and music after sundown. I learned to time my movement so I could observe without being noticed. Observing is an art. You need patience, stillness, and the ability to look harmless while holding a notebook titled Brad Surveillance #2 in plain sight. On day 2 of my watch, I discovered something important. Brad had predictable patterns. He hosted parties mostly on Friday and Saturday nights. Obvious, but the magnitude of the gatherings followed a pattern I hadn't expected. If the weather was slightly warm and the moon was half full, I'm not kidding. I started casually tracking the moon phases because why not? He'd up the ante. More people, more noise, more confetti. Holidays were peak chaos zones. Tuesdays, ironically, were his recovery days when his yard was suspiciously quiet and he'd be nursing a hangover like a wounded gladiator. Important tactical intel. The second discovery was even juicier. Brad's guests tended to arrive between 8 and 9 p.m. sharp. He liked to build momentum is what I deduced. Early arrivals set the tone. And after 10 p.m., the fence between party and complete madness blurred into an all-out stampede. That meant if I wanted to do something that would rattle him during his party, the window was narrow but predictable. Perfect. Next, I did something that would have embarrassed my younger self had he known. I checked for security cameras. Not in a creepy way. Again, I'm ethical about this. I walked the block and noticed the same little white dome camera mounted on Brad's chimney. Decorative, probably more for show than surveillance, but it gave me a clue. Brad cared about appearances. He liked the illusion of safety and control. That small detail would be important later when I decided how public I wanted my little masterpiece to be. I also did a little techno recon. Nothing fancy, just a quick ride on the neighborhood social media page where people posted lost dogs, bake sale flyers, and occasionally pictures of undercooked BBQ ribs. Brad loved posting party invites there with photos of his epic setups. It was like scrolling through someone's highlight reel. He'd share a photo of string lights and a punch bowl that looked suspiciously like it had been purchased the same week as his latest inflatable flamingo. The comments were full of emoji-fueled enthusiasm. People loved him, which meant the fallout when it came could be performative. After a few days, my notebook was brimming with useful data. I had a timeline, a list of likely guests, names when guests usually arrived, which ones left early, and more crucially, a map of weak points. That map looked less like a topographical survey and more like my personal battlefield blueprint, with arrows pointing to his back gate, the narrow strip between our fences where partygoers like to take smoke breaks, and the slightly uneven pathway that made the first step onto his lawn sketchy. Armed with this intel, I moved to experiment, because any good plan needs trial runs. Also, I'm a person who can be needlessly scientific about things. I set up small, harmless tests to see how Brad and his people reacted to minor annoyances. Test 1, the floating cup. I took one of the clear plastic party cups that always seemed to multiply like rabbits and floated it in my koi pond. Nothing evil, just to see if guests noticed odd things in my yard. The cup bobbed like a tiny raindrop. I watched from my window as a party guest ambled by, squinted into my pond, and then shrugged like the whole world was a low-budget production. Nobody cared. Important lesson, his guests were blissfully oblivious. Test 2, the garden gnome. I repositioned a garden gnome to face his yard. I'm not proud of this, but the gnome looked dashing, arm akimbo, like a century of tasteful sass. Guests laughed when they saw it. Some took selfies with it. The gnome, apparently, was an ambassador of mild surprise. Useful. Test 3, the lawn lamp. There was a lamppost on the edge of my yard that cast a soft golden glow at night. I changed the bulb to one that flickered every so often. My justification was ambiance. The result? 2 guests stopped mid-conversation, stared into my yard, and then blamed the weird electricity before resuming their dance moves. So, flickering light was noted but shrugged off. People will rationalize weirdness at a party. Every failed experiment taught me something. They also fed my growing confidence. Small disturbances were easily dismissed in the moment, but those same disturbances, applied in a more orchestrated pattern, could compound into genuine discomfort. I didn't need to destroy his party. I needed to be the mosquito that makes a person whisper, "Is it hot in here?" The mosquito that ruins a night. There was one experiment that went spectacularly wrong and is now the stuff of legend in my household. I call it the confetti test. Warning, do not attempt at home, and definitely do not attempt without a good plan for cleanup. I had purchased a small, biodegradable confetti pack online because I wanted to see how much mess a single innocent packet could cause in his yard versus mine. The plan was modest. Toss a small handful at the border between our yards to see if it would drift into his lawn or lodge in my flower beds. Biodegradable seemed noble, compassionate even. I tossed the confetti with the kind of theatrical flair reserved for people who are both angry and a little theatrical. The wind picked up. Confetti flew. It was glorious. Pink, green, and metallic flecks waltzed across the sky like an apology from a glitter factory. And then the neighbor's dog, Zeus, a gigantic, tail-wielding nightmare named after a Greek god with zero tact, charged through the front yard. Half the confetti rode his tail into my flower beds. The rest adorned his fur like a disco halo. I stood there, aghast, as the dog proceeded to run circles, jump into the koi pond, and then wring himself dry across my battered rose bushes. It was spectacle. It was chaos. It was a misdemeanor against my patience. I spent the next 3 hours picking confetti out of basil leaves and apologizing to a very annoyed Mrs. Patel, who had to lend me a broom. The confetti test was shelved. Lesson learned, confetti is a double-edged sword. It looked fun, but had the potential to spiral into farcical disaster if an animal got involved. The experiment series thus far had proved one thing. Subtlety was key, and I needed contingencies. Also, Zeus was an agent of chaos and possibly a shapeshifter. As the experiments progressed, so did my inner struggle. I'm not a monster. At night, I lay awake, turning over the ethics of my plan like a soil block, pushing aside worms of doubt and weeds of conscience. Would I be petty? Yes. Would I go too far? I had to make a rule. No permanent damage, no illegal acts, no actual harm to people or animals. My revenge had to hit pride and comfort, not health or safety. Petty-ish, but within the realm of human decency. Those moral boundaries were crucial because they kept the plan from becoming mean-spirited. There's a fine line between satisfying revenge and cruelty, and I was determined not to cross it. That meant no poisoning plants, no slashing tires, and definitely no wishing ill upon Zeus. The goal was discomfort and embarrassment. The theatrical, I see what you did, that would sting more than a broken stem ever could. Once I had my ethics in order, the plotting intensified. I moved from scattershot experiments to an actual step-by-step plan. It was elaborate in my head, and I wrote it down like a director preparing stage directions. The plan had 3 phases: preparation, execution, and clean exit. The preparation phase would involve subtle, reversible changes to my own yard to manipulate sightlines and pacing. Execution would be the party night infiltration of ambience and inconveniences. Clean exit was, of course, the part where I left Brad to clean up his own ego and possibly ask everyone why their shoes were sticky. Preparation included things like discreetly placing potted plants at the edge of my property to force certain traffic patterns. It also involved calibrating my sprinklers so that they could be timed for a brief and harmless sprinkling near his walkway at just the right moment. The sprinklers were the backbone of the plan, a gentle, unexpected dampness that would make people reconsider the safety of their party footwear. It had to be timed perfectly, not to soak anyone, but enough to make shoes squeak and hairstyles falter. Think of it as a mood dampener. I also invested in a small set of motion-activated chimes. The idea was not to terrorize, but to create a persistent, slightly unnerving soundscape that would be just foreign enough to make guests glance over their shoulders. You know how an unusual noise can crawl into your mind and ruin a song? That was the vibe I wanted. A party full of people is like a pot of soup. Too many flavors and one strange ingredient can turn it. Chimes were that ingredient. Another piece of the plan was psychological, indirect social pressure. I spoke to a few neighbors, carefully, casually, about the party culture. Not accusatory, not loud, simply a few well-placed comments about noise and respect for shared spaces. I wasn't organizing a mob. I was planting seeds. People talk. Rumors are like fertilizer. They make things grow. If the right amount of gossip sprouted, Brad might feel a subtle chill in the air that would make him second-guess future parties. The goal wasn't to ostracize him, but to nudge the social thermometer. Then there was the pièce de résistance, a harmless but embarrassing reveal. I envisioned a moment where the party would be interrupted by something that wasn't dangerous but would be humiliating enough to stink, like his music suddenly being overrun by a pre-recorded tape of awkward lullaby music, or a pre-recorded voice politely saying, "Is this a party or a hurricane?" It was theatrical, yes, but my inner playwright was having a field day. The idea was to lampoon the spectacle in a way that made Brad look self-important and slightly ridiculous, and that would cause his guests to reassess their behavior. Before I committed to the final act, though, I tested the water. I couldn't risk a full-scale humiliation only to have it backfire spectacularly. So I staged a miniature mock-up on a Tuesday evening when Brad had a small get-together. Apparently, Tuesdays now double as planning my big weekend blowout nights. I'm ashamed to say I felt a thrill as I executed a scaled-down version of the sprinkler timing and chime activation. The result was perfect. One guest slipped on the slightly damp grass, but recovered with a dramatic flair that became his personal anecdote. Another guest muttered about weird weather. It was subtle, effective, and left me high on adrenaline. Still, the mock-ups weren't perfect. One minor mistake: I set the chimes too close to the fence and they twanged like a set of metal spoons in a blender. A guest across the way poked his head out and yelled, "What the heck is that noise?" which was both a success and a warning. The sound needed to be uncanny, not insulting. I adjusted, tuned, refined. All this time, I was balancing the petty with the practical. I had to think like a host and like an architect of discomfort simultaneously. The more I planned, the more I appreciated the chessboard of it all. Each party guest was a pawn. Each light and each movement could be manipulated. My garden, once a victim, had become the command center. But conspiracy theories aside, there were personal consequences. My social life became absurdly focused on the impending night. I found myself declining invitations, feigning allergies, and spending evenings prone to bouts of manic giddiness as I toggled sprinkler timers and tested chimes. My friends called and asked if I was all right. I lied with the kind of half-truths only a petty person tells. "Oh, work has been busy." Which was true in a way. My job was temporarily managing the emotional fallout resulting from another person's party trashing my petunias. At the end of the week, I hit a sort of zen. The plan was complete. I had contingencies for rain, rescheduled the humidifier, moved chimes to the porch for unexpected guests, extra pot plants as buffers, and even for the dreaded Zeus factor, zealous owner to be politely confronted about leash control. My notebook had become a beautiful, slightly alarming testament to the lengths I would go to for vindication. There was still a moment, brief, honest, when I questioned myself. Was I petty? Obviously. Was it worth it? I thought about the hours I'd spent on the garden, the careful pruning, the whispered encouragements, the way Josephine the koi would glide like a living orange comma across the pond. The damage had been done. Brad had not apologized. He hadn't even offered to help replant anything. It wasn't just the garden, it was the message that someone else could stomp on something I cherished and move on without consequence. That's when the scales tipped from hesitancy to resolve. On the evening before the planned execution, I walked my yard like a general before a battle. The street was quiet. The only sounds were the whisper of the sprinkler and the far-off hum of traffic. I checked the positioning of the potted plants. I tested the chimes one more time. Soft, melodic, just odd enough to distract. I ran through the timeline in my head. Struck the sprinklers at 9:15 p.m., chimes at 9:20 p.m., released the pre-recorded audio at 9:30 p.m. It was almost religious, the way I paced and prayed for precise timing. And then I did something a little ridiculous. I spoke to my roses, not in a passive, good morning way, but in a direct, conspiratorial whisper. Okay, I told them. This is it. Hold strong. When it's over, I'll fix you. We'll plant stronger. We'll add a stone path. We'll be better. It was dramatic, borderline melodramatic, but it felt right. If revenge is a story, my roses were the protagonists. They deserved a victory scene. I went to bed with a racing mind, but a calm heart. The petty gears had been oiled. The timer was set. I felt absurdly virtuous. Maybe that's the strangest part. The moral high ground tastes suspiciously like peppermint tea and smug satisfaction. As I turned off my bedside lamp, I imagined Brad's face the next night when things began to unravel. The mild dampness on his walkway, the faint chimes that crept into conversations, the pause that spread across faces like ripples. I pictured his guests exchanging confused glances as the pre-recorded voice suggested perhaps they weren't in the most dignified of environments. I didn't dream of chaos or injury. I dreamed of a quiet, humiliating awakening to the reality that your party doesn't exist in a vacuum. When I finally fell asleep, it was with the simple certainty that petty can be precise, and precise is a lot harder to dismiss than brute force. The plan was set, the ethical lines were intact, and my heart was oddly light. I was no longer merely a victim of trampled roses. I was a strategist, a petty artisan with a single mission: to return respect to my garden. The next night, would be a test, not of who was right or wrong in some cosmic sense, but of whether one small, careful human could make another small, careless human feel the weight of their actions. It felt noble, in a way. It felt ridiculous too. Mostly, it felt like the calm before a very, very polite storm. And I couldn't wait. I didn't just plan revenge. I orchestrated a masterpiece. There's a special kind of calm that comes right before you flip the switch on something you've spent days planning. It's not menace so much as satisfaction. Like the moment a souffle rises and you know the kitchen gods are finally smiling on you. At 8:45 p.m., as the sun folded itself behind the roofs and the streetlights blinked awake like sleepy moths, I felt that calm settle into my bones. This was it. I'd rehearsed the timeline in my head so many times it had become a lullaby. Sprinklers at 9:15, chimes at 9:20, pre-recorded audio at 9:30. Simple, elegant, mildly humiliating. The goal wasn't to wreck a party, only to make it slightly uncomfortable, to jab at Brad's pride without bloodshed. The real art was in the small cumulative nudges that would make the whole evening feel off-kilter. At 9 p.m., I did the last-minute checks. The potted plants were in place, strategically heavy, not easily moved if someone tried to angrily shove them aside. The motion chimes were tucked among the hedges, disguised as wind ornaments. I'd set them on low sensitivity, enough to pitter the edges of conversation, but not enough to announce on the neighbor app that something suspicious was happening. The sprinklers were synced, the speakers loaded with the pre-recorded audio, and my phone, my remote orchestra baton, was charged and ready. Now, patience, and stalking with dignity. I watched from my kitchen window like a conductor spying on the audience. Brad's yard was a constellation of lawn chairs, fairy lights, and people who seemed blissfully unaware of the precise time when their dignity would be mildly inconvenienced. Laughter spilled over the fence in booms. Someone popped a cork. A party guest attempted a flirty throw of a confetti popper and missed spectacularly. But that was Brad caliber entertainment, chaotic and performatively joyful. At 9:12, a cluster of guests drifted toward the narrow strip between our fences to smoke. Perfect. At 9:14, I took a breath, thumbed open my phone, and started the sprinklers on the softest spray setting aimed to kiss, not drench, the path most used for quick exits and cigarette breaks. The water arced like a tiny, invisible orchestra. In my head, it was the opening note. Almost immediately, I saw the first ripple of effect. A guy in Converse shoes stepped onto the damp strip, felt the slight give, and made that face people make when the ground does something unexpected. The micro frown, one eyebrow ascending like a flag. He shifted his weight, looking around, and muttered something about weird do. The effect was small but real. One person's perception changes the mood in a group. Humans are social thermostats. We borrow feelings from each other. Squeak, then chuckle, then a shrug. The mosquito had landed. At 9:20, the chimes did their job. Soft, almost whimsical tones threaded through conversations like a worm of curiosity. They were placed just so that every time someone crossed the lawn near the fence, a delicate tinkling would chase them. It was subtle, insidious in its politeness. People paused. Conversations dipped. Eyes flicked to the source. Someone joked about a haunted garden. Someone else blamed the neighbor's artistic interior choices. The chimes did the important thing. They shifted attention outward, toward the environment, and away from the relentless party momentum. The thing I loved most was how tiny cues multiplied. The sprinkler made shoes unsure. The chimes made people ask questions. The band of attention swelled. And then at 9:30, like the final stroke in a painting, I hit play. A voice, calm, clipped, and just absurd enough, drifted from a small, weatherproof speaker hidden in my porch eave. Attention, party guests. For optimal party safety and neighborly courtesy, please note that excessive revelry may result in spontaneous sprinkling and mild social awkwardness. Thank you for understanding. The voice had an automated tone, like a service message you might get from a polite corporation apologizing for an inconvenience in 5 languages. There was a beat of perfect cinematic silence. Then, pandemonium of the most genteel kind. Conversation dropped. Phones came out to check the source of the voice. A guy laughed so hard I thought he'd snort. Brad froze mid-pour, a plastic cup tilted dramatically, his expression moving through confusion, embarrassment, and something like indignation. He looked around, scanning faces, scanning his party setup, clearly trying to find the person who had decided to publicly decree his party's mediocrity. I felt a warm, ridiculous burst of triumph. The voice had been the smart, theatrical jab I'd imagined. Not cruel, not dangerous, just precisely humiliating. Brad's guests exchanged glances. A few people laughed awkwardly. A few rolled their eyes. But the seed was sown. The party's nerve had been touched. Then things got messy in the best possible way. Not from my plan, but from the universe's innate talent for adding improv. Zeus, the aforementioned tail-wielding disaster of a dog, decided the sprinklers were an invitation. He barreled through the damp strip, slinging water, glittering confetti from an earlier fiasco caught in his fur, and his enthusiasm was contagious. A little splash turned into a slip slide, and someone's drink flew in an arc that would have earned applause at a water ballet. Everyone laughed. No anger, just the bizarre social laughter that happens when something unpredictable but harmless interrupts the rhythm of a crowd. Brad tried to reclaim control like a man grabbing a microphone in a karaoke bar. "Who said that?" he demanded, though his voice wavered between annoyed and proud. The awkward laugh response was a social shrug. "No idea, but that was weird." He checked his phone. A few people suggested turning up the music to drown out the voice. Someone suggested it was a neighbor prank. Someone suggested the sprinklers. People were too entertained to be angry. The night unfolded as a series of small, escalating embarrassments. My chimes chimed in staggered patterns, leading people to look around more often than was comfortable. The sprinkler cycles made several people do a wary two-step across his lawn, which somehow became a new, involuntary party dance. Someone slipped slightly on the damp grass and, in a heroic attempt to preserve dignity, performed a clumsy pirouette that was immediately memorialized on social media. My phone buzzed with a few anonymous comments posted to the neighborhood group. "Did you hear that voice? Is Brad okay?" The neighborhood had become a chorus. Of course. Not everything went to plan. There were near misses that had my heart in my throat. At one point, a couple leaned suspiciously close to the fence and squinted toward my porch like night detectives. I froze, fingers hovering over my phone like a pianist mid-aria. The couple lingered, whispering. I held still and pretended to be a person who wasn't orchestrating a symphony of mild harassment. They eventually wandered away, and I exhaled so loud I nearly disturbed the basil. Another near miss happened when Brad himself marched to the fence and banged on it. He peered into my yard with the kind of look people get on the highway when another driver nearly clips them. Equal parts fury and determination. I nearly dropped my cup of tea. He shouted something about neighborly respect, which earned a few nervous claps from some guests who liked the dramatic tension. He stalked back to his lawn, red-faced, muttering. In that moment, I briefly feared that I'd misjudged everything and turned from clever artisan into vindictive lunatic. But then he turned his attention back to music, and in the crowd's shifting attention, I saw the plan's strength. Humiliation without accusation. He was publicly vexed, but lacked a culprit. That was delicious. At one point, an overly enthusiastic guest mistook the sprinklers for a light show and decided to do a spontaneous interpretive dance. It was so absurd and joyful that the party almost regained momentum. I groaned inwardly, but also laughed because it was so human. The night refused to play the part I had written completely. It improvised, and I had to be ready to improvise too. When a group of teenagers attempted to climb onto Brad's inflatable flamingo, I still don't know why he owned one. Things threatened to spiral into actual danger. But the chimes, timed at that moment, set off a chorus of tiny metallic notes that sounded like a chorus of tiny alarms. The teens paused, glanced at each other, and climbed down with reluctant giggles instead of grand misadventure. Safety preserved. Victory maintained. Throughout the night, Brad's demeanor slid from performative host to flustered ringmaster. He kept glancing at his phone, checking comments, looking at the fence. Once he called out, half-jokingly, "Who's messing with me?" And a chorus of his fragrant ends yelled back in affectionate, disbelieving tones. No one loudly accused anyone. It was all whispers, smirks, and that strange, communal agility people use to avoid uncomfortable truths. One of the best parts, and this is where my petty heart swelled, was when someone staged an impromptu brag about how this was the best party ever, and then, mid-sentence, paused when the chimes played a soft, lonely melody. The pause was a microscopic chasm where pride leaked out and doubt seeped in. People rewound their social energy. Conversation threads unraveled and rewove around the idea that maybe tonight was a little off. The party's narrative was slipping from epic to peculiar, and I was the invisible editor redlining the margins. As the night wound toward its peak and then its decline, I watched people trickle away with small, bemused smiles instead of the triumphant whoops Brad aimed for. Some lingered, trying to figure out what had happened. Some left early, citing weird vibes. Brad, for his part, was exhausted, backed by a stage of confusion he could not name. He tried to shake it off with loud music and forced jokes. He tried to bond through blame. He even attempted to apologize for the sprinklers. Once someone joked he'd been sabotaged by an angry gardener. That line of humor landed awkwardly, and the conversation slipped toward a quieter tone. When the last guest left and the lights came down, Brad sat in a lawn chair and stared at the neon glow like a man surveying a battlefield that had not been won. The party had not been destroyed, but its shine had dulled. Pride, once lustrous, was now a little scuffed. I felt triumphant in the way you feel when you get a perfect critique in a contest you never entered, pleased, smug, and satisfied. I wasn't heartless. I walked to the fence and left a small note tucked into a mason jar of picked rosemary and thyme for my garden. The note read, "Roses take time. Sorry about your confetti. Please keep parties off the mulch." A neighbor. It was polite, oddly tender, and still hinted at my presence. It was the kind of soft diplomacy that carries a clear message without a raised voice. I wanted him to know someone had noticed, and someone cared. The next morning, the neighborhood group chat lit up like a string of holiday lights. Screenshots, memes, and half-accurate retellings cascaded in. People joked, speculated, and, in one delightful twist, someone posted a blurry photo of a gnome that looked suspiciously like it had been repositioned for dramatic effect. Brad, stubborn and bruised in ego, posted a selfie of him giving a thumbs up with the caption, "Best party yet." He sounded defiant. He sounded like someone still more invested in the performance than the audience's reception. A week later, I watched Brad fume under the polite eye of the neighborhood. He tried to amplify his next party but found fewer RSVPs. A couple of neighbors, careful, kind, mentioned they'd prefer quieter evenings. The social thermostat had shifted by the merest degree, and that degree was enough. He was confused and stressed and, bless him, completely clueless about who had orchestrated the charming little unraveling of his social event. There were a few consequences I hadn't entirely foreseen. Mrs. Patel brought over lemon bars and a conspiratorial wink. "You certainly made your point," she said, and I pretended to be modest while secretly prancing inside. Zeus, the canine agent of chaos, received 2 new squeaky toys from his owner, an attempt at atonement that made the dog exponentially more dangerous but also somehow more endearing. The koi pond recovered faster than I expected. Josephine flashed me a knowing flick of a fin as if to say, "We told you so." In the privacy of my garden, I planted a small row of lavender the next day, not because I needed more herbs, but because victory deserved perfume. I tended to the roses with extra care, whispering reassurances and perhaps a tiny boast. We did it. It was petty perhaps, but it felt like justice. It felt like restoring balance. The war was not bloody. It was not cruel. It was petty theater, executed with the kind of measured precision that only someone with too much love for begonias can conjure. Brad was defeated in the only way that mattered to me, socially, mildly, and without evidence. He remained oblivious to the mastermind behind the softly ticking chimes and the politely timed sprinkler. That ignorance sweetened the victory. When I walked past his front gate a week later, he gave a polite nod. I returned it with the kind of smile that says, "I hope your next party remembers to respect other people's mulch." He didn't know what I meant, and that was the point. He tilted his head as if considering whether he'd been cursed by a mischievous garden sprite. I walked away with my shoulders a little higher. There's an art to petty revenge. It should be creative, harmless, and precise. It should leave the perpetrator puzzled and the victim vindicated. It should also give you a story you can tell later with a wine glass in hand and a triumphant gleam in your eye. This one, I thought, would age nicely. And as the roses leaned toward the sun the next morning, their petals notched but stubborn, I felt something like closure. The plan had worked. The garden had been avenged. My sanity, oddly, had been preserved by a microscopic orchestra of sprinklers and chimes. I sat down on the porch with a cup of tea and allowed myself a small, private glow. You can call it petty, you can call it theatrical, you can call it childish. But when you love something, really love it, you sometimes do ridiculous things to protect it. I gardened for peace, but that night I'd orchestrated a masterpiece. I never expected to feel dissatisfied over a ruined punch bowl and a garden gnome, but here we are. The day after the incident, as I'd been calling it in my head, the street had a very different energy. Normally, our little suburban block had that gentle hum of people watering lawns, vacuuming cars, and the occasional leaf blower drama. But now, it was buzzing with speculation. Everyone was talking, carefully, like one of those whispered rumors in a high school hallway, but with mulch and mailboxes instead of lockers. From my kitchen window, I could see Mrs. Patel and Mr. Huang gesturing animatedly across their fences. Kids on scooters slowed to gawk at Brad's yard, which looked suspiciously orderly, but somehow still carried the ghost of confusion. Slightly tilted chairs, a half-deflated flamingo, and the tiniest shimmer of confetti stuck to his welcome mat. The conversation buzzed like bees, but with the subtle sting of judgment. It was a sweet kind of poetic justice watching the social ripple spread. No one knew who had orchestrated it, but everyone knew something had happened. I sipped my morning coffee, watching Brad shuffle across his lawn in a huff, muttering to himself about party sabotage and ungrateful neighbors. His guests had trickled away, leaving behind a mess of plastic cups, a single deflated flamingo, and a bruised ego. Meanwhile, my garden basked in the morning sun like nothing had ever gone wrong. The roses, slightly ruffled from my reconnaissance sprinklers, seemed to stand a little taller, their petals glistening as if winking at me. Josephine the koi swam in dignified loops, like an aquatic cheerleader celebrating a flawless performance. I felt the kind of satisfaction that only comes from knowing the universe, albeit through a small, meticulous human intervention, had been nudged in the right direction. Repairing my garden became both therapeutic and cathartic. I pruned damaged leaves, replaced trampled seedlings, and even added a few subtle improvements that I'd been contemplating for weeks. A small stone path curved gracefully around the flower beds. A new trellis supported a climbing rose, and strategically placed lavender along the fence not only added beauty, but acted as a sensory boundary for potential future invaders. It was ironic. The very destruction Brad had caused spurred me to make the garden better than ever. By mid-morning, the street chatter had taken a new turn. The gossip hadn't named names, but the narrative had shifted. Did you see Brad's party last night? People would whisper. Something was off. I caught snippets of neighbors joking about some clever gardener or the universe having a sense of humor. Some laughed behind sunglasses, some shook their heads in bemusement. Every comment felt like a tiny, invisible pat on my back. Brad tried to rally. He posted on the neighborhood app, attempting a mix of bravado and damage control. "Best party yet," he claimed, followed by an array of party emojis. It was almost endearing, like watching a man cling to dignity on a windy rooftop. But everyone who had been there knew better. A subtle karmic equilibrium had been restored, and he didn't even realize it. I had a few funny run-ins that morning as well. The gnome I'd repositioned during my experiments, now a permanent sentinel at the edge of my property, received several furtive stares. One passing neighbor even muttered, "That gnome, something about it," and then scuttled along. I smiled. Gnomes may not wage war, but they sure as heck can observe it. There was also Zeus, the canine agent of chaos. Brad's attempt at redemption, buying 2 new squeaky toys, didn't stop him from zooming across yards with reckless enthusiasm. I watched from my porch, laughing as he careened through Brad's yard again, this time narrowly avoiding a half-empty punch bowl. The chaos was harmless, but poetic. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor. By afternoon, I was fully immersed in restorative gardening. There's something meditative about repairing what was broken, especially when it's yours. Each small action, pruning, planting, watering, felt like a statement of ownership, of care, and of victory. I even planted a few small wildflowers along the back border, giving the yard a slightly whimsical, untouchable charm. Brad could throw 1,000 parties. He couldn't ruin beauty that had roots deeper than inconsideration. That evening, I noticed a subtle change in neighborhood dynamics. A few families who had been regular attendees at Brad's weekend extravaganzas were conspicuously absent. I heard whispers of, "Last night was weird," or "Maybe we just stay home." I grinned. Subtle social consequences, untraceable yet entirely satisfying. Brad's next attempt at a party came a week later. I watched from my window, curious, a cup of tea in hand. He had strung up lights, inflated the flamingo once again, and was blasting music with the gusto of a man determined to reclaim his reputation. But something had shifted. His audience was smaller, his energy a little frantic, and the laughter lacked its usual confidence. Subtle whispers floated toward my garden. "Did you see that? Yeah, last week was weird. Maybe just a quiet evening." Even the sprinklers and chimes, though untouched, felt like a psychological presence. The memory of last week's orchestrated chaos hung over the event like a ghost. I allowed myself a smug little chuckle. Petty? Definitely. Effective? Absolutely. Back in my garden? The roses thrived, the lavender released its fragrant defense line, and even the basil looked sturdier than ever. Each plant seemed to lean into the morning sun with pride, and I couldn't help but feel like I'd not only defended them, but elevated them. My labor had produced a dual victory, aesthetic and moral. I spent the evening reflecting on the entire ordeal. Petty? Perhaps. Worth it? Unquestionably. The satisfaction wasn't just in seeing Brad mildly flustered. It was in reclaiming space, asserting boundaries, and transforming chaos into art. Revenge, I realized, doesn't have to be mean-spirited. Sometimes it's a creative, harmless, yet undeniably satisfying expression of self-respect. Before bed, I walked the perimeter of my garden one last time, feeling the earth under my shoes, the weight of victory light on my shoulders. I whispered to the roses again, and they seemed to shimmer as if in agreement. I leaned against the fence that separated my sanctuary from Brad's chaotic domain and allowed myself a private grin. Petty? Yes. Clever? Absolutely. Satisfying? Beyond measure. And as the night air settled over the street, the faint hum of distant traffic and the soft chirping of crickets mingling with the fragrance of lavender, I allowed myself a small, smug declaration to the universe. Sometimes, small, precise, and harmless acts of genius are the sweetest victories of all. Petty? Maybe. Worth it? Absolutely. All right, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the story. We have so many more amazing stories coming your way, so make sure you hit that subscribe button. Our goal is to reach 100K subscribers by the end of this year, and we'd love for you to be part of this journey. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.